So I promised I'll talk to you a little bit about good and evil, virtual punishments, virtual crimes and real punishments. How many of you have taken an ethics class before? Don't worry, this won't be a philosophy lecture, but okay, 1, 2, all right. So I'm going to very quickly, very simply recap what it is we're talking about when we're talking about good and bad, good and evil, right and wrong. So ethics is a branch of philosophy that deals with how we ought to live, the idea of good and what's right, what's wrong, and how do we distinguish what's right, what's wrong. And basically what ethics is concerned with is value judgments, which are the assessments of the merit, desirability, praiseworthiness of someone or something. So when we say that something's good or something's bad, we make a value judgment. However, it's crucial to understand that if you say something like, say, the current speaker has a very poor fashion sense, for example, no colors, all black, then while that is a value judgment, it's not a moral judgment. So maybe I have a poor fashion sense, but that doesn't mean I'm necessarily that person, right? However, if you say that it is wrong for the current speaker to withhold information, that is a normative moral value judgment. And the issue I'd like to throw up today is, can you make these kinds of judgments about games? And can you make these kinds of judgments about virtual actions? In other words, can you do something that's morally praiseworthy or blameworthy in a game, and can you do something that's morally praiseworthy or blameworthy in a virtual world or a virtual environment? So let's start with games and non-computerized games, just to get us going. Now, let's start with an example so we have something to think with and think about, all right? Let's consider football. How many of you actually play football or have played football? Okay, 1, 2. Right, so occasionally people get hurt, right? I mean, it's not the goal of the game, unlike boxing, but occasionally people get hurt, right? Now, so every now and then someone gets a boot up their you-know-what, and so on and so forth. If you kick someone outside of football, you get penalized. Fines, maybe some prison time. But if you kick someone in a football game, then at worst you get a card, right? However, in 2004, a Dutch football player committed a foul against another football player, and the foul was so unfortunate that the other player suffered a horrendous broken bone. They broke their leg in multiple places. It was pretty nasty. So of course the offending player got a red card, as you do. But on top of that, the Dutch court actually gave him a criminal penalty. And the judges reasoned as follows. The offense of the player was so grave that the rules of football and the penalties foreseen by the rules of football were not severe enough to reestablish justice. Now, I'd like to do this less as a lecture, more of as a discussion. So every now and then I'm going to throw out cases or ideas like this, and I'd like to hear your responses. So, what do you think? Was the court right in this case? Or do the rules of a game always trump, always trump whatever other norms we might have outside of games? Just intuitively. You don't have to give me a good argument for or against, but just intuitively. In other words, the player ended up, I think they did a bit of prison time as well for assault, even though they charged the other player during the game. So what do you think? Was it justified? these are the kinds of things I'm going to torture you with today. So, and this ungodly hour. Okay. So you'd say that sort of laws trump game rules? Okay. Would anyone disagree? Okay. Could you give an example?
Because, for example, let's think about embassies, embassy cars, vehicles, and let's think about airports, where you have these gray areas.
Okay.
You can apply the laws of other states, or should apply. So it's not always certain where some law is in effect and where it isn't, because it's enforced. It's not something that comes naturally.
Okay. So you'd make the case that a game is sort of like an embassy or an airport, that in the boundaries of the game and its rules, the rules trump laws.
No, not really. I would say that in an embassy vehicle, you get the laws of the country of the ambassador. So if it's legal to smoke marijuana in, let's say, Amsterdam, Holland, then Netherlands, then...
Just go to the embassy.
Yeah, no, go and take a ride in the Dutch ambassador's car and you can smoke weed. So, yeah, but...
Does anyone know the Dutch ambassador?
But I wouldn't say that a football field or a football game would be enough of a, let's say, legal power to overrule that enforcement. So it needs to be...
But on the other hand, think of the example of boxing. People voluntarily risk bodily injury in the case of boxing. And, I mean, getting knocked out is bad for your brain. It really is. Don't try it. But you risk it voluntarily when you choose to be a boxer. And if you end up suffering brain damage in your old age, then you don't really have anyone else to blame but yourself. Or, I don't know, should Muhammad Ali have sued all those people who threw the punches that perhaps exacerbated his Parkinson's disease?
Could have.
But could he? Well, anyway, so these are the kinds of topics I'd like to torture you with today, and one could try and make the case that actually the judges were mistaken. A classic idea of games, what games are, comes from Johann Huizinga. He argues that a game is a non-serious activity that occurs outside of ordinary life. And that activity is governed by its own rules. And as such, any action that you commit within a game is right or wrong only with respect to those rules. Nothing else applies within the magic circle that the game rules establish. Now, if that's true, then it seems that the court was wrong. The rules of football should have been enough. Okay, it was an unfortunate event, but still. Criminal law doesn't reach within the football field. So this seems to imply that games are beyond, to borrow a famous, or paraphrase a famous title of a famous book, games are beyond good and evil. You can't do anything bad or good in a game. You can just play according to the rules or go against the rules. So there's actually an idea in a discussion in information ethics. And there's an idea or a view which claims that actions within games and actions in virtual worlds are never wrong. They cannot be wrong. Precisely because a game and its rules establish a sort of a magic circle that stands outside of society temporarily. So while you're in a game, you can do no wrong. So for example, you could say that theft or betrayal in a virtual world isn't morally wrong because virtual worlds are associated with games and actions within games are never wrong. They're not the kinds of things that can be right or wrong. So what do you think? Do Do you believe this? Would you agree with this?
I have a question.
Sure.
Basically, the same football analogy that you used. If a football player would shoot another football player during the game, would this be something that would be taken seriously, or would this be like, oh, it's just a game, you know? So he gets the red card, but the other player dies or suffers a severe injury. Like,
Well,
that's also in the game. So
that would be a very convenient way of getting rid of people you don't like. Just get them to the football field and then pull a gun.
And the worst punishment that you're gonna get
Is
is
a red card. Okay, you can't play for a couple of seasons. Don't care. I'm rid of Bob.
Yeah.
Bob's gone.
I didn't like him anyway. So.
Exactly.
Let's think about the regulations of having firearms or melee weapons, so to say, on the field.
Well, okay. Suppose you can't bring a gun, but you kick someone in the head hard enough, they die. Red card. So actually, that's a very good counter argument that you just gave, precisely to the point that I made. That what if you and I agree to play basketball, and you're better than me at it? You keep shooting, your shots keep going in, and I'm getting frustrated, and I can't really get the ball from you. So I decide that I'm going to headbutt you and take the ball. Well, the penalties of the game probably aren't enough to sort of mitigate this situation. So not only if I headbutt you, for example, in the case of your example, you shoot the other player, not only have you broken the rules of the game, but you've also done something that is morally wrong. It doesn't matter that it occurred inside a game. So, should we give up the idea that in-game actions can never be wrong? Maybe not. Let's try again. Maybe we can give a better defense of this view. How about this one? If an action within a game is in accordance with the rules of the game, then it's morally acceptable. So if something like, say, in games that occur in virtual worlds, say, if you're playing a game where virtual theft, say in Grand Theft Auto, stealing cars, right? If virtual theft is okay according to the game rules, then you haven't done anything wrong. If it's in Doom, if it's okay according to game rules to shoot things endlessly, then again, you haven't done anything wrong. So, going back to our football player, his intention wasn't to break the other player's leg. It was just an unfortunate tackle. And tackling, to some extent, is in accordance with football rules. So, maybe it is still the case that you can do no wrong in a game.
I was thinking that when things go financial, let's say when you bring in real money, then the legal court will take action. For example, in a game where you have a cash shop, let's say like in Diablo 3 or the MMOs, you have these, let's say, auction houses where you can trade gold for real money. When theft goes on there, then you can make a legal case out of that because real currency is involved.
Yeah, that's a good point. But how about this one? Against the idea that, well, if you consent to the game rules, then it's A-okay. What if you have a game with just immoral rules? An immoral or bad game? Has anyone read Stephen King's novel, The Running Man? Or have you seen the film with Schwarzenegger in the 80s? Bunch of neon and so on. Yeah, right. So, in that game, the contestants' goal is to stay alive, and they're given a 12-hour head start before they're chased by hunters who attempt to kill them. And each contestant is given extra monetary rewards the longer they stay alive, and they're given bonuses for killing the hunters and other players. Now, if we consider the action of killing someone, then that action, even though it's permitted by the rules of that game, still seems to be immoral. Still seems to be a kind of action that you could say, no, that's wrong. Even though it's in accordance with game rules. Now don't worry, I'm not going in the direction where I ultimately want to end up with the conclusion that you are all bad people for playing Grand Theft Auto. No, you're not. That's not the point that I'm aiming at.
So in the real world, you have it as the final thing.
Yeah.
In the game world, it's just event.
Yeah. That's a good point. By the way, that's an interesting difference between games and other media, like novels or films. If a character in a novel or a film dies, then that's a momentous event, because they needn't have died, and usually they'll come back, do they? But in a game, if a character dies, there's a temporary penalty. Death carries very little meaning in most games. Think of Mario. Every missed jump, you just come back again. Okay, you lose your lives, you start a little further back, but nothing momentous happens. If a character in a novel dies, then that is a big, weighty event. But okay, yeah, you could make the case that in games that don't sort of proceed in virtual worlds, yeah, they have real consequences, so immoral actions. Maybe that's a good way to transition into considering virtual actions. But to sort of wrap up this discussion of non-virtual games, so what do you think? Can you do bad things in games or not? Are some actions in games bad or not? The whole point of this isn't to persuade you one way or the other, it's just to think about these things a little bit. Would someone say that despite everything we've said and thought about right now, no, it's still pretty much games are outside of the sphere of good, right, and wrong?
The question is whether law enforcement can catch up with these new rising trends.
Well, that's one good question.
Because we already have these problems with intellectual property.
Yeah.
We are trying to enforce intellectual property laws to things that are not physical, laws of physical property.
Yeah.
That's really a lot of the
Yeah.
gray areas.
Yeah, that's true. Copyright laws were originally created for physical properties like books. Now that you have e-books and other intangible properties, it's a lot harder to enforce copyright laws, and you run into all sorts of conundrums with them. But then the question arises: what about one thing? One thing is whether law enforcement can enforce those laws, but the other thing is whether a community of players can appeal to an action being right or wrong in chastising other players. Let me tell you a story, an example, and this is a good way to transition into considering intangible actions, like virtual actions, similar to intangible property, like intellectual property. Do you know, it's a very famous case actually, but this is the case that sort of started the whole question of can you do bad things in virtual environments. Have you heard of the Lambda Mu case in the early 90s, the first so-called virtual rape? Has anyone heard of it? Don't worry, it's not nearly as nasty as you might think. Has anyone ever played a mud or a moo before? You know what they're like. They're basically, okay, has anyone played World of Warcraft? Or at least seen it, you know what it is.
Yeah.
Right, so it's a massively multiplayer online game, fully three-dimensional world, right? So a mud or a moo is a similar thing, but no visuals, purely text-based. Nothing visual at all. So what you get is, for example, you enter an area in a world, you get a 1 or 2 paragraph description, say you're in a room, there's a dwarf floating 2 feet in the air, and then so on and so forth, right? Now, in 1992, in Lambda Mu, one player's avatar took control over a couple of other players' avatars and have them perform sexual acts on his avatar. this ultimately amounted to nothing more than everyone who was logged into the game saw other users' names and descriptions of lewd acts. Written descriptions, nothing else. No visuals, nothing. The only thing is that the players whose usernames were involved in those descriptions, whose avatars were involved in those descriptions, had no control over their accounts and their avatars at the time. Now, what followed was a rift in the online community that had grown up around this move. One half, roughly, of the community argued that this was something immoral, that this was qualified as a form of rape, and that the perpetrator should be punished. The other half of the community argued that, come on, get real, this is a game. Nothing serious happened. Nobody suffered. There were no physical harms at all. We come here to pretend and make believe. So, again, question for you.
I have a counter question.
Yeah.
Why can't we have like real life Hunger Games if you've seen the movie?
I've seen the movie. Would you want to participate in them?
Sure, but that's not the point. So I think it's a thing of consent. One
Partly.
thing, to answer the football
But is it the case that consent can make everything permissible?
Yeah, but you can't have something that's illegal by nature. A game that doesn't go well with like real life laws and stuff. So that's why we don't have a Hunger Game, so to speak.
Well, okay, nothing that's sort of immoral or unacceptable by nature. How about cannibalism?
I think it's also illegal.
It's illegal, but notice it. Not everything that's illegal isn't immoral, and vice versa.
Well, we're going for it.
I don't think so. For example, lying is perfectly legal in most cases. It's immoral, but it's legal. Or having bad intentions. Suppose you have a relative that you really can't stand. Every Christmas you meet them and they start cracking the same stupid jokes again and again every year. So, and you dread this Christmas. You know it's going to be horrible when they show up again. So this year you figure, I've had enough. You buy a gun. You go to a gun range, you train. You become a master marksman. And you get ready, you prepare. When that Christmas dinner comes, you take your gun with you. And the moment they open their mouth and start cracking that same stupid joke again, you put one between their eyes, right? Only thing is, you get there, you're mentally prepared, you have your gun, and they don't show up. They move to Australia. You don't shoot anyone. You don't do anything. Nobody dies. It's the first happy Christmas party you've had in years. You've done nothing illegal. But we could chastise you for having bad intentions on the grounds of morality. So they don't overlap entirely. But anyway, coming back to your question, I would answer your question with a question, does consent make everything all right?
Well, there's the law thing, you know.
Yeah, there's the law thing, but let's ignore the law thing for the moment. Let's just look at the right or wrong thing. Suppose you and I start playing a game of poker, right? And we consent to extremely bizarre rules. The winner gets to eat the loser. Suppose you consent, I win, for theft. For the stealing of, get this, virtual furniture. In the online game, Habbo Hotel. Furniture. And they obtained the usernames and passwords of other players by deceit. And then transferred their furniture, those other players' furniture, to their rooms. And they were convicted. So, unlike in some earlier cases, for example in RuneScape, where players were physically threatened to give up their account their passwords and account details. There was no, as far as I know, there was no physical coercion. Were the judges right to convict someone for stealing virtual furniture? Is it even theft to steal virtual furniture?
this also brings to a question of did Habbo Hotel have terms of service, and was this actually legally set in stone? That the theft of accounts and the removal of items in progress on these accounts, whether this is theft or not.
That's one good point. But let's think more generally, perhaps. Can you steal virtual things? Is it a kind of thing that you can steal? Please elaborate.
Then he just uses the time as currency.
Okay.
So you steal the time they have used on this game.
Okay. So it's sort of like a workmanship model that you create value by investing time in a game, for example, just as you create value by investing time in your workplace, and that makes the object, whether virtual or not, economically valuable. And when someone takes that from you, you suffer a loss of value. So hence it's theft. Okay.
There's also the question of how physical is intellectual property, how physical is patents, for example.
Yeah.
And also, if you buy like stocks in a stock market, they're not physical things. But if someone steals your stocks, all hell breaks loose.
Oh yes.
Or how physical is the money on our accounts?
Not anymore, actually. Not after the US untied the dollar from the gold standard.
Exactly.
So one could say that yes, you can steal virtual items because they satisfy most traditional economic definitions of valuable objects, of things that have economic value. But notice, whether you can or can't steal virtual objects, or whether there is such a thing as virtual theft, depends at least partly on how we understand the notion of virtuality. What are virtual things, in more general terms? So, what are they? Well, one idea that's had currency in contemporary discussions is that virtual entities, like virtual furniture, are fictional things. They're similar to characters or items found in novels and films. So, but if this is the case, then you can't steal virtual things. Because you can't steal a fictional thing. And a fictional thing doesn't have any real value. So, you could argue that virtual actions are not wrong because they took place in a fictional environment. And fictional actions can't be wrong.
But let's think of it as this. Once the furniture, even though it was consisted of pixels, there was still consisting of ideas of wealth and value. So it would be quite far-fetched to actually call them fictional. I can understand if you call fictional a narrative of a game, but this has nothing to do with the narrative. This has something to do with game mechanics, something more tangible.
Well, okay, but suppose I have a, I don't know, say, hypertext fiction that reacts to the reader. You have something akin to mechanics there, but the objects are still fictional, wouldn't you say?
This starts to go very deep into meta-ethics already.
I'm going to try and keep it light.
Yeah, because there's also the question of like exactly how do we generate what is bad? How do we decide on what is bad and what is good? How do we enforce these things, etc. All these things are going very deep into it.
Well, it's late in the night, so what better way to spend the time? But no, all joking aside. Actually, your point that you made before, when you said that stocks are basically virtual, well, the idea that you might as well say that they're in a way fictional, but losing them still means losing value. And furthermore, I personally at least think that the idea of thinking of virtual things as fictional is mistaken. For example, all of you have smartphones in your pockets, right? And all of you probably have some sorts of, I don't know, Google Maps or Wikitude or whatever, some augmented reality app on it. So suppose you ask Google, where's the nearest restaurant? What you get is on your screen is a virtual restaurant, a virtual representation of a restaurant, right? But the restaurant isn't fictional. In other words, my point is, even though some virtual things, say dragons in computer games, are fictional, not all virtual things are.
Can I butt into
Please do.
philosophy of language? Because if you talk about this restaurant that is virtual, then it's more of a reference to the real thing.
Yeah.
But semantically, does it mean that we can refer to a fictional? For example, if you refer to the Socrates, we're mostly actually referring to a virtual thing, not a fictional thing, although we think it's real. So the line is getting blurry here as well.
It sort of is, but my point precisely is that not every virtual thing is a fictional thing. They don't all refer to fictional things. Now, another thing you could say, of course, and this is another famous idea, and this one's probably more familiar to you, is that virtual things are computer simulations. Interactive computer simulations. This is the most recent understanding of virtual things, actually. It comes from roughly the 1950s. When you look at the history of ideas, it's the most recent. So, according to this view, you could say that stealing virtual items or virtual rape are wrong, because they either have real-world consequences outside the simulation. You steal my virtual money, I lose real value. Or participants have and suffer through real psychological trauma, for example. When we come back to the virtual rape case that I mentioned, the participants were traumatized sort of during the events. One of them reported crying behind their screen and so on and so forth. So this view sort of permits the possibility that you can steal virtual items and so on and so forth.
We can also think about virtual bullying. I mean, trolling as it is, named under a large general term, is becoming illegal. Swatting is illegal. All these sorts of virtual bullying, even in Estonia, you can enforce someone for virtual bullying. Yeah,
that's true. So this view is perhaps the most amenable to the idea that you can steal virtual things, you can do virtual wrongs. However, it's not perfect. I remember visiting a video game philosophy conference a couple of years ago, and one of the presentations there was very interesting. The author of the presentation argued that actually computer games don't simulate. Because if you think about computer simulations, usually a computer simulation is a simulation of some real-world system. What does a dragon simulate in a computer game? There is no real-world system. Mario doesn't simulate jumping. Nothing jumps like that. The Earth's gravity would have to be way, way, way weaker for you to be able to jump like that. So there are limitations. But for the time being, it is perhaps the best sort of compromise we can come up with. But to wrap up, since we're running out of time, can you think of an example or a case where you would say that a virtual action or event was something that you intuitively feel was definitely right or wrong in your own gaming experiences? And again, I'm not interested in the kinds of games where the games permit you to do things that in the real world you'd consider to be immoral. Stealing cars and so on and so forth. Nothing like that. I'm more interested in massively multiplayer online environments where multiple players interact, where things can happen that game designers didn't foresee.
But opponent or somebody will find out who you are and let others know too, and then tease or something like that. It can go very bad.
Yeah. Plus, to sort of wrap up on that note, perhaps, another thing is that there are certain actions in online games, virtual actions, that the rules are ambivalent about, but that can actually detract from the value of the game. For example, we've all heard stories of toxic play environments where, for example, unwanted attention from male players to female players actually drives female players away from games. The game rules are ambivalent about that.
I think the gender of these players is irrelevant as well. You never know whether it's female players actually.
That's also the case.
Actually, there is research that there are now as many
Yeah.
that don't come out and say it.
Yeah. Precisely because of the online sort of interactions that this would entail in many cases.
Also, retail, mobile marketing, casual marketing, etc. So they don't like go to some games. Some games definitely have a larger audience than other games. And
True.
some games have a larger female audience than other games. So it's a bit as well.
True. Do you have any questions?
Are we still on for dinner?
Are you good at poker?
No, I am.
You are?
Sure.
Well, we'll discuss that at the bar. Thank you.